The SR-22 arrived in 2001. It was fast, comfortable, and year after year, throughout the 2000s, it became the world's best-selling piston aircraft, with more than 2,800 units sold. So why was an airplane that kept getting more popular also killing so many student pilots every year? This phenomenon was surprisingly similar to what had happened with the Cessna 172. Then, is it technical issues with the SR-22, or just pilots being overconfident when flying it? First, you need to understand what makes the SR-22 fundamentally different, because an SR-22 is not just a Cessna 172 with Garmin screens. From the outside, the two airplanes look broadly similar. 4 seats, 1 engine, tricycle landing gear. But underneath, they come from two completely different generations of design philosophy. Let's start with the wing. The SR-22 uses a composite wing with a discontinuous leading edge, a design originally developed through NASA research. Near the wing root, Cirrus built in carefully engineered stall strips that deliberately disturb the airflow before the outer sections of the wing are affected. The result is highly intentional. As the aircraft approaches a stall, the wing root loses lift first, while the outer wing sections, and the ailerons attached to them, remain effective. That means the pilot can still maintain roll control all the way to the edge of the stall. This characteristic was so effective that the FAA ultimately allowed Cirrus to bypass the traditional spin certification testing requirements. On paper, it was an exceptionally clever solution. In practice, however, it quietly removed many of the physical warning signs that generations of pilots had instinctively relied on throughout their flying careers. The buffet became weaker, the control feedback became subtler, and the airplane often remained surprisingly well-behaved right up until the situation became genuinely dangerous. On older Cessnas and Pipers, an approaching stall usually comes with plenty of warning. The airplane starts buffeting, the wing shakes. Those vibrations travel directly through the control cables and into the pilot's hands. You feel it, and more importantly, you get a few precious seconds to recognize what's happening and react. The SR-22 is different. Instead of a traditional yoke, it uses a side yoke connected to a spring-loaded feedback system designed to simulate control forces. The problem is that as the airplane slows dramatically toward a stall, those spring forces don't really change. The controls don't suddenly start talking to you. There is no meaningful buffet being transmitted into your hands. The side yoke is cleaner, more ergonomic, and a much better fit for a modern cockpit. And at the same time, it doesn't tell the pilot that the airplane is about to stall in any language that 20 years of flying Cessnas taught them to understand. Then there's wing loading. A Cessna 172 carries about 14.7 pounds for every square foot of wing. The SR-22 carries roughly 23.5 pounds over that same area, about 60% more. Higher wing loading is a huge advantage. The airplane rides noticeably smoother in turbulence and delivers significantly better cruise performance. But it also changes how the airplane manages energy. And that's where many pilots get caught out. As an SR-22 approaches the runway, it's carrying substantially more kinetic energy than a typical trainer. It doesn't bleed that energy away easily. It doesn't slow down naturally. It wants to keep flying. A pilot who learned to judge the flare by feel in a 172 can suddenly find the SR-22 floating far down the runway, long after they expected it to settle onto the pavement. The airplane is still doing exactly what physics says it should do. It's just not behaving the way their instincts expect. And then there's the engine. The SR-22's IO-550 produces 310 horsepower, almost twice the output of the 150 or 180 horsepower engines found in most training aircraft. And that power is turning a much larger, heavier propeller. The result is dramatically stronger torque effects and significantly more P-factor than many transitioning pilots have ever truly experienced. P-factor is the tendency of a propeller to produce asymmetric thrust. When the airplane's nose is raised and power is high, the descending propeller blade generates more thrust than the ascending blade. That shifts the center of thrust to the right and pulls the nose noticeably to the left. Every pilot learns this. Every student is taught to counter it with right rudder. This is basic flight training. In reality, though, the 310 horsepower version of P-Factor feels nothing like the 150 horsepower version that most pilots spent years developing instincts around. The rule is exactly the same. The forces are not. The effect is dramatically stronger. And a left leg calibrated by hundreds of hours in a Cessna doesn't automatically know how much right rudder an SR-22 is demanding. The airplane hasn't changed the laws of aerodynamics. It has simply turned the volume way up. Quick favor before we continue. Almost 80% of you watching right now haven't hit that subscribe button yet. If you've picked up something new, or just enjoyed hanging out here, smash that subscribe and drop a comment to let me know what you think. Thank you very much. Now, let's put all of the technical characteristics above into the traffic pattern. The pilot pulls the power back on downwind to begin the descent. In a Cessna 172, there's usually a comfortable margin built into that maneuver. The nose comes up slightly to hold altitude, and even if the pilot reacts a few seconds late, the consequences are rarely dramatic. In an SR-22, it's a different story. The higher wing loading means that even a small delay can be enough for the airplane to lose 100 to 200 feet before the pilot fully realizes what's happening. COPA, Cirrus's pilot and safety organization, tracked more than 36,000 landings over a 5.5-year period. What they found was striking. This wasn't an occasional mistake. The same pattern kept appearing over and over again, across the fleet, across different airports, across pilots with vastly different experience levels. And the problem doesn't stop on downwind. It follows the pilot all the way around the pattern, through base, through final. And it becomes especially dangerous at the exact moment when workload spikes the most. The flare, or a low-altitude go-around. The flare is where physics and pilot history collide most violently. As the airplane crosses the runway threshold and the pilot begins raising the nose to reduce the descent rate, the angle of attack increases. In a 310 horsepower airplane, that nose-high attitude combined with a spinning propeller can generate remarkably strong P-factor, strong enough to pull the nose decisively to the left unless the pilot is actively holding sufficient right rudder. Most pilots know this in theory, but when the sight picture is changing rapidly, the runway is rushing underneath the airplane. Everything is happening faster than conscious thought can comfortably process. And in that moment, feet calibrated by years of flying Cessnas don't automatically provide the amount of right rudder an SR-22 is demanding. The nose starts drifting left. The natural reaction is to correct with aileron, the exact response that 10,000 hours in smaller airplanes may have deeply hardwired into muscle memory. Now the airplane is cross-controlled at 50 feet. Aileron in one direction, not enough rudder in the other. The inside wing carrying more drag than the outside wing. And if a stall develops, it doesn't arrive with a dramatic warning. It just arrives. April 24, 2021. Mustang Beach Airport, Texas. SR-22. November 587. Charlie Delta was approaching runway. 30. Low and slow. The pilot recognized the unstable approach and made what appears on paper to be the correct decision. Go around, full power. Immediately, the IO-550 responded. Prop wash over the tail increased dramatically, pitching the nose sharply upward to roughly 22 degrees. The required response was surprisingly counterintuitive. Apply slight forward pressure on the controls to stop the pitch up. But that's almost the opposite of what many pilots have spent their entire training history learning. For decades, they've been taught that when you go around, you pitch up and climb. At the moment, control was lost. The airplane was indicating 71 knots. The flaps were fully retracted. That was completely inconsistent with the POH procedure, which calls for approximately 50% flaps during the initial go-around phase. With the flaps retracted, stall speed increased to roughly 68 to 70 knots instead of around 59 knots with the recommended flap setting. A safety margin that was already thin became dangerously thinner at exactly the worst possible moment. The left wing stalled first. The airplane rolled sharply left. From the moment full power was applied until impact, less than 8 seconds. Then it happened again. September 2025, Macon County, North Carolina. An SR-22T approached the runway too high and too fast. The pilot abruptly pulled power to salvage the approach. Airspeed decayed rapidly. The airplane drifted away from the centerline. When the pilot attempted a low-altitude go-around with full power, the sequence that followed looked disturbingly similar to November 5, 87 Charlie Delta. The outcome was, tragically, almost identical. On paper, a go-around is absolutely the correct decision when an approach becomes unstable. In reality, performing a go-around in an SR-22 requires a very specific set of deeply ingrained responses: forward pressure, aggressive right rudder, correct flap management in the correct sequence. The problem is that those responses are often not yet embedded deeply enough in pilots whose instincts were built in smaller, lower-powered airplanes. And when the airplane gives them only a few seconds to react, instinct, not knowledge, is usually what takes over. Do human factors play a role in the accidents? Yes. The typical SR-22 accident chain rarely begins with a mechanical failure, and it usually doesn't begin with unexpected weather either. More often, it starts with something much smaller. A subtle shift in mindset, something that develops quietly over hundreds of routine, uneventful flights. And one of the reasons that shift can happen is because the SR hard limits. To fully deploy and slow a spinning aircraft to a survivable descent rate, CAPS requires at least about 920 feet of altitude and more than 1,000 feet in some of the newest versions. But the most dangerous part of an SR-22 flight, the final approach and the flare, happens below 200 feet. At 50 feet, where many SR-22 accidents actually occur, the parachute is essentially irrelevant. There simply isn't enough altitude left for it to work. And there was a plane crash in July 2025 in North Carolina that deserves to be mentioned. A SR-22 registration, November 5656, Mike, crashed after running out of fuel. Fuel exhaustion was the direct cause of the accident. But when investigators arrived at the wreckage, they discovered something unexpected. The CAPS activation handle was still secured. The safety pin had never been removed during pre-flight. The parachute that might have offered a last chance to save the 3 people on board had effectively been locked out of service before the airplane ever left the ground. Not because the system failed, not because it malfunctioned, but because a checklist item had apparently been missed. Perhaps because, deep down, the pilot never truly expected to need it. And that's the danger of complacency. It changes which steps start feeling optional.